Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Let me offer you a situation. You want to build a perfect ring of beacons. Whether it's on your survival world or a giant SMP full of a bunch of people, you need some extraordinarily pretentious and overtly exorbitant method of displaying your vast amounts of wealth. This means that you're only going to settle for the perfect ring of beacons and the perfect rainbow gradient to go all the way around you, because if you're going to go this far, you're only going to settle for the absolute best of what's available. Except you're not going to, because the amount of people who actually need this sort of information is close to zero, so it's best to probably treat this as a baking tutorial for a cake you'll never bake. But it doesn't matter, because I promise it's interesting enough anyways, and who cares if nobody's going to make it? The idea is there, and this is what we're going to be talking about. So that means today's video is about beacons, rainbows, why perfect beacon circles don't actually exist, and why making super imperfect circles like this one is the closest you'll actually ever get to making a perfect one. So where do we start? Well, it actually begins with the first beacon video, which was done about covering the ideas behind rainbow beacons, gradients, and all that jazz. This was centered about a specific survival project that I worked on in this half-baked survival world I ditched many months ago, but I essentially created this giant curtain of rainbow beacons. And it's actually a very natural progression to try and turn this into a circle, because we actually look at the band of colors. It actually starts with purple, right here, and also ends with purple. And this is just the way that the colors blend together. So it makes a lot of sense to take one side and sort of string it around and hook it up into the other. The place it made the most sense to put was in the end dimension, right at the center of the island, because it's already kind of circular and I've already got a pretty big build going here. So I started to plop it down, but then I immediately ran into two problems. Number one is there's a lot of garbage around here, and I mean garbage as in full blocks, because just like in real life when you're creating lighting, you have to hide the lights and show what the lights are supposed to show. The problem is beacons have to be buried underneath the ground, and that means that you can't have any solid blocks above them, which means that they have to all be placed in spots where any beacon position can be swapped with either a carpet or maybe an endstone slab baked into the ground. The other problem is a lot more sneaky, and it essentially revolves around the idea that whenever you're trying to work with anything circular or round in the Minecraft's three-dimensional cube grid is going to try and stab you in the back. The thing about circles in Minecraft is that they're often thought about as really difficult, but they're actually really easy. Using any sort of computer program makes it super simple to generate any circle, and there actually just so happens to be a circle that contains 96 beacons, which is the exact amount required to achieve the full color spectrum we're trying to create in this project. But unfortunately, this circle just isn't going to cut it, and the only way to see why is to actually build the beacons itself. I've changed these to light gray so it isn't absolutely insanely blinding, but you can still definitely notice the problem when you stand in the center and look around you. Okay, maybe the problem isn't that glaring, but if you're going to go to this extent to create an incredible beacon ring, you're going to want to patch out every single possible error. And the error I'm trying to point out here is the inconsistency in the distance between each beacon beam. If you look directly in a cardinal direction, like this, you can see that the distance between the beams is fairly uniform. But if you move towards one of the more diagonal axes, you start to see these really big gaps. The reason this occurs is kind of obvious, but I'm going to explain it anyways. The thing about this is when you're observing these beacons right here, you only have to move one relative block over to get to the next beacon beam from the perspective of the center. But when you move over to each of these moments where the block skips over, this distance becomes slightly different. As you can see, we can very visibly see when that skip happens, and it leaves a kind of horrible gap. This becomes more accentuated when you get to the diagonal sections where it's essentially all skips because you're going diagonally, that's just how the circle works, which leads to far more distance between the beacon beams here than there ever would have been between these single block jumps over here. And in order to resolve this problem, we need to actually stray outside of the standard circle given to us by computer programs over there in the back, and make sure every single beacon beam from the perspective of the center is exactly the same amount of camera turning degrees, like so, to get to the next one. And attaining that objective is what lands us with this incredibly sporadic beacon placement as described here. And if you look closely, this actually also resolves our other problem of being incredibly encumbered by the presence of a bunch of solid blocks everywhere, because we can actually get a lot more options than the original circle that we had created, allowing us to put beacons in places that tactfully avoid sections like this, where there are too many solid blocks obstructing possible beacon beam burial sites. Okay, this idea is super fun and all, but how do we actually create this? Well, the way I chose to do it was I have this armor stand here, and every time I click this warped fungus on a stick, it rotates by a very small amount. That amount is 1/96th of a circle. Every time I click this other stick, it'll shoot out a little particle trail that will travel at exactly that line. And the objective is to simply go to every single 1/96th of a circle turn, and try and find a spot where that ray almost directly intersects the center of a block. In this way, each evenly spaced ray actually acts as the position where a beacon should be relative to where the player is, and this allows us to create that even spacing, while still finding actual spots to put our beacons that lie within the cubic grid of Minecraft. And if we look closely one more time, we can see that for the most part, each of these rays is going to intersect a target block. At least for the most part. There are some ones that are slightly misaligned, but ultimately doesn't matter in the super big grand scheme of things. It's really hard to notice. Now, a problem that might already be brewing in your head is the fact that a lot of these beacon beams are actually different distances away from the center. These ones are very close, while these ones are very far. What this actually ends up doing is decreasing and increasing the actual size of the perceived beacon beam due to it being farther or nearer. But ultimately, this doesn't matter a whole lot, nearly as much as the distance between beacon beams problem that we face with that light gray cylinder over there. As you can see, it's a lot less noticeable than the other problem, and certainly creates a far more pleasing effect. So now we've got the spots for where all the beacons lie, how do we actually implement the gradient? What I did then was installing a little sign on every single block that tells you which number it was, and then I simply assigned each of these numbers with a specific column of glass based on the big color feed tape that I showed off at the beginning. If you want to learn how these color gradients actually work, you can figure it out based on the video that I made a while back. It's not very good, but it basically explains the topic. Then I went ahead and ported that to more easily visible concrete blocks, and made this big giant diagram for me to build and cross-reference in survival. Yes, this was kind of super tedious, especially drilling all the holes through the ground, placing all the transparent blocks, as well as placing every single perfect glass rod of color, but in the end it ended up creating this incredibly cool effect, which made it all worth it in the end. Another neat design choice I implemented is making the wiring to all these pistons, to the button that turns it on and off, incredibly sporadic, and what that ends up creating is this sort of warehouse light switch flickering effect that causes them all to blink off in completely random order, which just leads to a very nice opening and closing animation. Anyways, that'll be it. If you want to see more stuff where I'm actually explaining things, even though the rest of my channel is more redstone oriented, I definitely have a lot of content that's centered in this style. If you want to have a chat with me, or just discuss random nonsense about stuff that's entirely unrelated, go check out our Discord server. It's a pretty cool place, that'll be in the description. And if you want to see more, make sure to like and subscribe, and I'll see you next time.